Okay, welcome in. I'm now going to review all of Week Six's matchups of the NFL season. I'll go over the teams that I predicted that did win. Sorry, the teams that I thought would win, the teams that actually won, and the outcome of the game, records, yada yada yada. So the Thursday night matchup took place in Kansas City between two AFC West rivals. Well, it's not really a rivalry if one team's completely dominant over the other one, and I knew that the Chiefs are going to win this one. I did predict them to get the victory, and they did. 19-8 was the final score. So the Chiefs have now improved to 5-1, and the Denver Dumpster Fires have fallen to 1-5. Take a look at the Sunday matchups right away. So the Ravens and the Titans took the field against each other on Sunday. This was actually the third game in London, and I believe there's one more to come, if I'm not mistaken. So, despite the fact that the Titans did have home field advantage, even though they weren't home, they were not able to get the victory. I did predict Baltimore would get would win, and they did. Final score 24-16. The Ravens have now improved to 4-2, while the Titans have fallen to 2-4. Take a look at the next matchup. Okay, so the next matchup took place in Georgia, where the Atlanta Falcons were host to the Washington Commanders. I did predict that Washington would get the victory. It was not meant to be. Sorry, I predicted Atlanta would get the victory. It was not meant to be. Final score was 24-16. So both of these teams are now sitting at 3-3. Our next matchup takes place in Illinois, where we had two NFC North foes take battle. To say that the season has not gone as planned for either of these teams would be an absolute understatement. Both these teams coming into this matchup only had one win, respectively, each. So obviously, unless there was a tie, something had to give. I did predict that Minnesota would finally get off the schneid and be able to get a victory, and they did. Final score was 19-13. So Minnesota is now sitting at 2-4, while Chicago, just like several other teams, are sitting at 1-5. Our next matchup takes place in Cincinnati, where we would have the Seattle Seahawks. Oh, tablet just moved. Went into Cincy to take on the Bengals. I did predict that Cincy would finally get back to 500 after having a very slow start to the season, and they sure did. Final score was 17-13. Cincinnati, like I said, they are now back to 3-3, 500 football. Seattle are now sitting at 3-2 because they had their bye week. Our next matchup takes place in the same state as the Cleveland Browns were host to the San Francisco 49ers. And I believe this was one of the two upsets that happened on Sunday. I believe myself, as long as anyone else is a football fan, would have guessed that the 49ers would have gotten the victory to stay undefeated on the season, but it was not meant to be as they missed a late fourth quarter field goal that would have evidently given them the victory. It was not meant to be. So final score from Cleveland, 19-17. So as I said, San Fran has now suffered their first loss of the season. They are sitting at 5-1, while Cleveland is sitting at 3-2. Our next our next game, I apologize, takes place in Texas, where we would have the New Orleans Saints, who would go into Houston to take on the Texans. I did predict that the New Orleans Saints would be able to get the victory in this one. It was not meant to be. Final score was 20-13. Both of these teams are now sitting at 3-3. Staying in the AFC South, we actually had two AFC South foes face off against each other in the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Indianapolis Colts. I did predict that Jacksonville would get the victory in this matchup, and they surely did. Got a massive win at home, 37-20 was the final score. Jacksonville has now improved to 4-2 on the season, while Indy has dropped back to 500, sitting at 3-3. So if I can move that back a little bit so you can see the logos a little bit better. That's good enough. Okay, so our next matchup takes place in Florida. So the Miami Dolphins, who have been red hot all season, came into this matchup atop of the AFC East division, while the Panthers are in dead last in that NFC South division. I did predict Miami would get the victory. They actually doubled up the score on the Panthers. 42-21 was the final. So Miami is now improved to 5-1, while the Panthers are still looking for their first win of the season. They're sitting at 0-6. Our next matchup takes place in Sin City. As the New England Patriots went into Las Vegas to take on the Raiders. I did predict that the Raiders would get the victory. They've been off to a shaky start, but they managed to get back to 500 football. They are now sitting at 3-3. New England has dropped to 1-5. This is the first time since I believe in like the mid 90s that New England has been at a 1-5 record. Final score from Vegas was 21-17. Our next matchup is back in Florida, where we had a very surprising team in the Buccaneers, and they took on a very intriguing team in the Detroit Lions, who I did predict would get the win, and they did. 20-6 was the final score. So Detroit has now improved to 5-1. They're sitting on top of that NFC North division, while Tampa Bay, they have dropped. Don't say they've dropped, but they are still having an above 500 record because of their bye week. They are now sitting at 3-2. Off to California, where we'd have Los Angeles Rams, and they would take on an AFC West foe in the Arizona Cardinals. One team, obviously, going to be struggling to say the least in the Cardinals, and while the Rams are starting to kind of get their mojo back together, I did predict that the Rams would get the victory. They have now gotten back to 500 football, sitting at 3-3. Cardinals have dropped to 1-5. Final score from LA was 26-9. Our next matchup takes place in New York, where we had our second of the two upsets, as the favorite Philadelphia Eagles went into New York. Like I said, along with a lot of other people that would have predicted this matchup, I think that the Eagles were easily heavily favored, but they just seemed like a shell of themselves, to say the least. Final score from New York was 20-14 for the Jets, who have gotten back to 500 football at 3-3, while the Eagles suffered their first loss of the season, so they are now sitting at 5-1. Staying in the state of New York, the Sunday night matchup took place in Buffalo, where we had the Buffalo Bills, who would take on the New York Giants. And to say that the Giants are having an off season would be an understatement, especially after making the postseason last year. And obviously, they won their wild card. They went into the divisional round. And now to be where they're at is unreal. And for the Bills, obviously, they've been kind of shaky. Win one, lose one. They haven't really been consistent, to say the least. I did predict that Buffalo would get the victory. It was very close. New York almost came away with an upset. It came down to the last second. And obviously, an incomplete pass in the end zone ended the game. So final score was 14-9 for the Bills. So they are now sitting at 4-2, while the Giants have fallen to 1-5. And then the Monday night game took place in Los Angeles, where we would have the Dallas Cowboys, who would go into LA to take on the Chargers. I did predict that the Chargers would get the victory, and they almost did. But as the old saying goes, they always seem to charger against a lot of teams, and it was not meant to be. Final score was 20-17 in favor of the Cowboys. They have now improved to 4-2, while the Chargers have dropped to 2-3 on the season. So with my picks this past week, I was 10-5, which isn't too terrible. My overall record is now sitting at 55, and where am I? 41. So 55-41, pretty respectable for my picks. The two teams that had their bye week in week 6 were the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Green Bay Packers. As always, if you happen to like this kind of content, I do videos on the daily. If you're new to this channel, feel free to hit that sub button. It'd be greatly appreciated, to say the least. And as always, take care.